We are here to talk about the regulatory update of parking requirements for the town. This is a project or an initiative that has been funded through the Massachusetts Vulnerability Preparedness Program, also known as the MVP program. And it's looking at parking requirements, the existing parking requirements, through a lens of sustainability and climate adaptation. So with that, we have our consultants here, Mary Kate, MK, and Stacy from Beals and Thomas. And they've been working really hard on this project, getting us to this point. So I will turn it over to them for their presentation tonight.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And MK, I'm just going to jump in quickly. So folks, I'm going to be taking notes tonight. MK's doing the brunt of the presentation. I'll also be moderating the chat. So if we don't get to your question right away, I will keep track of it. But if the caller with the number ending in 70 is able to unmute and just identify yourself for the meeting notes, that would be great.
Yes, I can't get on the Google Meet, but my name is Shannon Wall.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yes, I'm also here with my mother, Carol McAdam, and she's dialing in as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Stacy, for moderating for me. Just a couple little housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded and it will be posted online afterwards. So anyone who doesn't see it is able to refer back to it. So with that in mind, please keep yourselves on mute if you are not actively speaking, just to reduce background noise. But with that, we will dive right in. My name is Mary Kate Schneeweiss. I also go by MK. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a senior environmental planning specialist with Beals and Thomas. I am also a municipal vulnerability preparedness provider. So what that is I have gone through a training that the State Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program has put on that helps towns and partner towns and consultants to come up with a number of climate adaptation projects. I'll get into that a little bit more as we go on, but today we are talking about parking in Shrewsbury and the updated regulatory effort we've been going through. So our presentation tonight is going to go through the background and goals of this regulatory update. It's going to provide a summary of the public survey that was distributed this spring as part of this update. It will provide an overview of the proposed parking regulations as they currently stand, and then an outline of next steps moving forward. So, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness was established by former Governor Baker as part of the climate roadmap that his administration came up with. Essentially, what this program did was it provided two categories of grants to municipalities. The first was the MVP planning grant that asked communities to identify the climate vulnerabilities that are unique to them and come up with strategies to adapt to a change in climate for each of those vulnerabilities. Consultants like us, the MVP certified providers, were trained to help facilitate this process. Then the second category of grants is the MVP action grants, which provides funding for towns to complete the projects that they identified as part of their planning process. So Shrewsbury, I believe, was one of the first, if not the first, community to get certified under the MVP planning process. So congrats to the town for being very forward-thinking even back then. One of the actions that was identified through the planning process was to work on model bylaw language and model parking standards to reduce the amount of impervious coverage in the town. Last year, late 2022, Shrewsbury received a grant from the MVP program, a $90,000 MVP action grant to address this action. We have Hillary King, the MVP regional coordinator and also Shrewsbury resident on this call. So just thank you very much for all of the support you've given this process, Hillary.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So the goals of this project were to review the town's existing parking bylaw, which is part of the zoning bylaw, as well as innovative model parking bylaws that could be used to update that. In particular, we focused on the model smart parking bylaw that the state's smart growth toolkit had developed. We also looked to other municipalities in Massachusetts to see how they had incorporated climate resiliency as well as parking, as well as states other than Massachusetts. We pulled a little bit from Portland, there was some from California. So this was a very broad base of research that we pulled from to develop the regulations we're going to be presenting today. The focus of these regulations are going to be new parking requirements that is going to reduce the total impervious area that's required to be constructed as part of development, and substitute that impervious area for some sort of green development, whether it is a solar canopy or a low impact development, rain garden. We can sort of get into that as how those regulations incentivize those things differently. That was intended to be focused on new developments. The project is also hoping to incentivize owners to redesign existing parking lots that may be under capacity, or rather I should say over capacity, that have too much parking, to reduce the total number of impervious area in town. And then the last goal was to inform the public as to what we are doing, why we are doing it, and the climate benefits of what we are doing. So I'm going to just kind of very briefly go over something that I had presented at the original public outreach meetings that we had in April. But there are a number of climate drawbacks to excess parking. First of all, having excess parking encourages reliance on motor vehicles, which can release greenhouse gases, and it can contribute to local air pollution and noise pollution as well. It requires significant impervious area, which prevents rainwater from filtering back into the ground and can result in poorer water quality of runoff. It can contribute to social inequity as well, since many people in the country do not own cars, but they may be paying taxes on parking spaces and roads that they just don't utilize. And it also has, reevaluating our parking standards also has benefit for development, since parking spaces are very costly to construct and they take up land area that could be used for something beneficial otherwise. So we did kind of a detailed overview of these climate benefits. And actually, I should say one more, the heat island effect, which is that local areas of high heat are often found in areas where there's significant parking, because it reflects, or I'm sorry, it absorbs the sunlight rather than reflects it. So the first step of this regulatory update was to provide some education on these climate features, as well as some innovative strategies for reducing parking. This was presented in 2 public outreach sessions. One was held at Town Hall, the other at the library. We tried to reach as broad a base as possible. We also offered an online survey for people to get a sense of what sort of improvements to parking areas are important to them, how they use parking areas, and what they would like to see change in the town. So those surveys were distributed online. They were made available through the town's website. They were also emailed to town meeting members and business owners in the Lakeway Business District. There were also hard copies available at the public input sessions that we held, and there were also hard copies available at the town hall and library. So just to give you a sense of how Shrewsbury residents and workers utilize parking, there was a total of 66 respondents, which I think is actually great. Almost all of them were Shrewsbury residents. So almost all of the survey respondents lived in Shrewsbury, 95%. And more than half of those people also went to Shrewsbury for shopping, dining, or recreation. Of the survey respondents, 100% of them said they get around Shrewsbury by car. So Shrewsbury is a community that very much has been based upon motor vehicle transportation. Of those 100% respondents, 38 of them said they use driving exclusively, so no walking, no biking, and no public transit. As a matter of fact, public transit had no respondents saying that they use that to get around Shrewsbury, which I think my understanding is that there's the Worcester Regional Transit Authority has a bus line that goes to town center, but at least among these survey respondents, that doesn't represent a significant portion of people who are using Shrewsbury amenities. But second to driving was walking. Approximately 60% of survey respondents walk around Shrewsbury, and approximately 13 get around by biking. So the second portion of the survey asked what areas, just anecdotally, had insufficient parking, what areas were you never able to find a space and it was difficult to navigate. And there was a couple common threads throughout each of these responses. We saw a lot of people saying grocery stores didn't have sufficient parking, particularly the Trader Joe's and Whole Foods were called out. There was also government services, so the town hall and library, as well as the post office, were called out as areas that don't have sufficient parking. Recreation areas during sports season and certain times of the year, such as Dean Park, Jordan Pond Walking Trail, and the Maple Avenue Recreation Area. And then a number of respondents indicated that there was insufficient parking in town center. Just as a brief side note, this regulatory update is not going to apply specifically to town center. There is a comprehensive multimodal study going on that will address town center specifically, but we just wanted to reflect the quite frequent comment that town center parking was something that people struggled to find. We also asked respondents to identify areas that had regularly empty parking lots, that had provided too many parking spaces that were never used. Far and away, the biggest commonality between these areas was large retail on Route 9. So a couple of the ones that were called out by name were White City, Home Depot, Staples, Fairlawn Center. Interestingly, Stop and Shop was a grocery store that was noted as being empty more often than the Trader Joe's and the Whole Foods. A couple others were Maple Avenue and Route 9 and Shrewsbury Village. So this echoes one of the exercises that we did at the public outreach meeting in person back in April, where we asked people to put sticky notes on plans of retail areas where they thought they had seen insufficient parking, or they always saw empty areas, or areas that were hazardous to bicycles and pedestrians. So this is the Stop and Shop and the Staples parking lot here, just as an example. You can see there's wide areas that people had identified as frequently being empty, a couple areas on the entrances that were hazardous to bicycles and pedestrians, and one area near the restaurant that was frequently where parking was unavailable. Now, this kind of feeds into something interesting that when we asked survey respondents what was important to them in parking, the most common response was people wanted a short distance from the parking space to the destination. So people wanted to be able to park very close to where they were going. So hence, a high traffic destination like a restaurant, people want to park close to that, even though there's abundant parking available that no one uses in the areas that are closer to the Stop and Shop and Staples, which I thought was interesting. But respondents also identified landscaping and shade as being important to them. Next most important was pedestrian and bicycle accessibility. Then large parking spaces sufficient for SUVs or trucks. And then last among the list that we provided, there was access from public transit. But respondents came up with a number of their own suggestions that were important to them that we just wanted to reflect here because I thought they were great suggestions. Couple people suggested that in electric vehicle parking spaces were very important to them. Free parking that is no charge and is readily available. and then spaces that are ADA accessible. So those are the other amenities. I would say ADA accessible spaces isn't so much an amenity, but those were other parking needs that people felt were very important in the town. Now, with all that information in mind, we used it to inform how we went about developing these regulations. So we developed a table of updated parking ratios for each use in the zoning bylaw. These updated parking ratios will apply to new development, significant redevelopment in existing developed areas, and then a change in use of an area. So for instance, if a building was to be retrofitted from something that has a very high parking demand, like a restaurant, to something that has a very low parking demand, actually, it really would be the other way around. Something that has a low parking demand that would then be required to have additional parking, this regulation would apply to them. There are also design standards for the parking areas. Those apply to just new parking areas. So it wouldn't apply to the second two cases, the significant redevelopment or the change in use. They wouldn't be required to retrofit an entire parking area. But owners of those existing parking areas are given options to take advantage of these new regulations. And we'll go through what some of those incentives are in the coming slides. So before I get into this, do we have any questions before we get into kind of the meat and bones of the regulations?
And I'll say there is a raise hand function at the bottom if folks do have questions, but there's nothing in the chat, MK.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Stacy. So first step for developing new parking areas is the permitting process. So the process that these proposed regulations the process that these regulations propose is that any development that adds 10 or more spaces, whether that's a new parking area or an existing parking area, must go through site plan review from the planning board. Lots that are smaller than 10 spaces are just subject to approval of the building inspector, which would determine to what extent the regulations apply. So that's more of a discretionary review for smaller spaces. As part of the submission to the planning board, these new regulations will ask applicants to provide an estimate of the number of spaces and impervious area that would be required under the current bylaw, and use that to estimate how much impervious area would be avoided under the new bylaw. So essentially there's a, Stacy, remind me what the term we came up with was it was the,
I don't recall.
I don't recall either. But essentially the existing bylaw regs would be a larger area with additional parking, and the proposed bylaw would have a smaller area with a quantification of how much impervious area was avoided to be constructed. So the reduction in impervious area is going to be accomplished by adjusting the parking ratios. So under the existing regs, the town has tables that establish a minimum number of parking spaces that each use must provide. The new table is going to adjust that approach based on the smart growth model bylaw that we used as a starting point, as well as additional industry sources such as the Institute of Transportation Engineers and the Urban Land Institute. This approach has essentially a range of parking spaces. So there is a baseline number of parking spaces that's very similar to the current maximum. Then it's very similar to the current minimum. Then there is a lower end, a minimum number of parking spaces that is approximately 80% of that baseline. So there's an 80% variation to within which a parking lot can be permitted. The regulations are giving the planning board the discretion to require the maximum reduction in the number of parking spaces possible for that individual site. It will take into account a number of different site characteristics, such as proximity to existing parking areas, and provides a number of avenues by which the applicants can factor in that reduction. There's 4 avenues in particular. The first is by taking advantage of shared parking. The second is by using off-site parking. The third is reserve parking. And the fourth is establishing an in-lieu fee program. So the shared parking strategy, I think this slide's going to look familiar for anyone who attended the first 2 outreach meetings, but shared parking essentially allows uses that are on the same site that have competing demands to essentially use the same parking space at different times of day. So an office is going to have its lot most filled from the hours of about 8 to 6. A restaurant, probably people will start to park there 5 later at night, and then housing people will park there overnight. One of the things we identified in our research is that there's an average of 3 to 6 parking spaces per vehicle in the US. So given shared parking, there doesn't necessarily need to be. You can factor in multiple uses on a similar site to reduce the total number of parking spaces. There are some uses that have a higher daytime demand and some uses that have a higher nighttime demand. The other reduction strategies that we evaluated were that can be used in combination with shared parking or on their own is off-site parking. So if a proposed development is located in the vicinity of an existing lot that has surplus parking, so one of those areas that we had identified with the green dots is within 1,000 feet of the new entrance. And if the applicant provides an agreement to the planning board, if the parking lot is owned by a different entity that says that that agreement is satisfying the terms of this regulation, an offsite lot can be used to satisfy parking requirements. There's also provisions for reserve parking, which basically allows for some variation within that range, the baseline to the minimum that we establish. So constructing greater than the baseline number of parking spaces will require a waiver, and constructing less than the minimum number of spaces will also require review, but it will simply be the site plan review process. Essentially, what this will allow applicants to do is to set aside an area that will be built as parking if it is needed. However, if after a number of seasons or a year or so, if it seems that that parking will not be needed, that area that would have been parking will be left undisturbed, or if it had already been cleared, it can be restored with landscaping. So essentially, it provides some flexibility in the event that the parking ratios won't satisfy demands on one end or the other. And then the last provision that we're looking into or incorporating in the draft regulations is an in-lieu fee program. Through that, the town would establish a reserve account or revolving fund to which applicants could make a contribution. That contribution would be so many dollars per space, and those funds would be used by the town to either build new spaces if they were needed, but hopefully would be focused on eliminating impervious area and creating open space amenities. Business owners will, if we do proceed with this route, there is a proposal that the reserve account can also be used by business owners for redevelopments. We'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation.
Yeah, and just to clarify on the business owners using it for redevelopments, it would be if they're retrofitting their
yes, to comply with, yes, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Stacy.
To comply with the new bylaw.
Yeah, to comply with the new bylaw. So that is how we are focusing on reducing the overall number of parking spaces in the overall impervious area. These regulations are also focused on making these parking areas more climate friendly through a number of different strategies. So there are stormwater management standards landscaping standards, and standards for heat island reduction that, again, new parking areas are going to be subject to. So the stormwater management standards, as outlined in this bylaw, will make all parking areas subject to the Mass DEP Stormwater Handbook, even if they would not otherwise be subject to it because they are located in the upland. So under the existing regulatory structure, a parking area would only comply with the Stormwater Management Handbook if it was located in the buffer zone to wetlands. So it would only be subject to the design and treatment standards if it's within 100 feet of, say, a stream, a wetland, or if it's located within the flood zone. The new regulations would require the Stormwater Handbook to be applicable to all parking areas. The updated regulations also encourage low impact development practices. These are practices that mimic the natural stormwater filtration in order to get water back into the ground as opposed to directing it into a combined sewer overflow system or a place where it's not going to return to the aquifer. Those strategies include reuse of stormwater through a cistern, bioretention areas and rain gardens, particularly if they are planted with native plantings, tree filters, vegetated swales that direct runoff over grassed areas, and then permeable pavement. So looks like a normal pavement, but it does allow some level of infiltration as opposed to concrete, which doesn't allow essentially any. So on top of the stormwater standards, there are separate landscaping standards. If a applicant chooses to use the low impact development solutions, those may count towards a landscaping standard. We're going to be asking applicants to provide 10% of parking area as landscaped open space. There are a number of design standards. We're still evaluating some of the specifics of them, but in terms of what plants are available to plant, there's going to be a focus on native plantings and trying to avoid landscaping that provides very little environmental benefits, such as grass, trying to focus on low-growing shrubs as well. There's a number of different ways that these landscape standards are proposed to be applied. Every so many spaces, there's a divider island and a terminal island. And the idea is to break up these large areas of impervious that create these heat island effects and provide very little infiltration. So on top of the landscaping standards, there is a set of heat island reduction standards that tie into the landscaping standards. So a applicant can provide shade trees in these landscaped areas and achieve a 50% parking lot shading factor after so many years. There's an appendix that we used, I believe it was based on Rentham, that gives a species of tree, the estimated canopy width after so many years, and an area that applicants can use to say, all right, if I plant this tree in this location, it's going to provide 75% shading within a 35-foot area, for instance. If an applicant is not interested in planting trees, if they are focused more on low-growing shrubs, which they may want to do for reasons of visibility, they can also employ alternative strategies to accomplish a heat island reduction. So it would be a similar 50% of the parking lot would employ one of these strategies, such as an innovative cool pavement that reflects less light than asphalt, or I'm sorry, reflects more light than asphalt. Can also use pervious pavement or car park solar canopies, so solar that is located over parking areas. Those will all be counted towards this heat island reduction standard. So those are the design standards for parking areas that we chose to include in this bylaw. We are asking owners of, or we are incentivizing owners of existing parking areas to take advantage of these standards by providing retrofitting incentives. So essentially, the proposed bylaw would allow area that is existing impervious to become a building, a leasable area. Would it have been required for parking under the old bylaw? So if there's an existing developed site, rather than saying, this has to be open space, landowners can take a parking area and have additional leasable space using the new parking regulations that require fewer parking spaces for a use. So essentially, a bylaw would have to comply with all, or a development would have to comply with all other provisions of the zoning bylaw, but they would be allowed an additional leasable area. So it would incentivize them to reduce the total number of parking. There is also an incentive for owners who reduce the total impervious area without providing a building. They can apply to use that reserve account to provide some of the open space amenities in their parking area, or they may receive a reduced infiltration and inflow fee. Chris, I know you were working with the town engineer on the specifics of that, but the idea being there will be a financial incentive for not developing additional building area in the parking lot, as well as the option to provide additional leasing area. So we are in the process of preparing a summary report that goes over everything that we've been up to over the past seven or 8 months. So it's going to provide a summary of the public process. It's going to provide an analysis of existing parking areas in Shrewsbury and what those might look like under the new regulations. It's going to provide an overview of all of the strategies that I outlined today, and will provide much more detail than I did. It will also go over recommendations that we are suggesting for other regulations that may not be appropriate in a parking regulation, but could also have a benefit. So for instance, incentivizing carport solar, we do have that provision for the heat island reduction, but that may be more appropriately addressed through the town's solar bylaw. There's electrical vehicle parking spaces. The town has the option to opt into the opt-in municipal stretch code, which would require new developments to provide additional, oh no, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Yeah, no, that would be an option for energy resiliency, but it wouldn't provide additional EV spaces. I apologize. But the other strategy that we were recommending for other regulations was additional wetlands protection. I believe, Louise, correct me if I'm wrong, the town did pass its first wetland bylaw at this past town meeting?
Yes, they did.
Excellent. So I assume the Conservation Commission will be developing regulations through that, and they can factor some of these analyses into those regulations. And lastly, the summary report will provide a summary of strategies that we evaluated, but ultimately did not think were appropriate for the town at this time. In particular, we looked into whether or not the parking ratios could be adjusted for developments that were very close to public transit, and ultimately felt like, as the survey bore out, that there wasn't sufficient public transit access in Shrewsbury to have that be a benefit, but it will be put in this report as a recommendation in the event that these conditions change in the future. There will be a record that it had been considered and could be adopted again. And then lastly, the report will just have the appendices of all of the public outreach materials, all the research, as well as the draft regulations. So next steps, the final draft regulations and report will be due June 30th. That is when the municipal fiscal year ends. So that is not the end of the process, however. The town will be able to adopt these regulations at a town meeting. The regulations will be out for public comment during the process where it is considered for adoption. And we are welcoming any comments you have right now on this conceptual overview of the regulations, as well as any other comments on parking in Shrewsbury you may have.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, MK. I just have one question before we kick off the question period. One person joined partway through, and I think the last two of their phone number was 66. If you don't mind just letting me know who you are so I can grab you for our meeting notes. I wonder if I can unmute you. You seem to be muted. I am not able to unmute you. I think you have to unmute yourself. Luis, do you know how to unmute if you're calling in?
You know, I'm not positive and I can't.
*7 unmutes people who are on the phone.
Oh, thank you, Beth.
Beth.
Thank you, Beth.
So *7 for any of the callers that are muted, if you have input that you'd like to provide, and if the 66 number would like to identify themselves as well. But we have a few callers on the phones.
Hi, this is Jeff Heidelberg. I'm from Beals and Thomas.
Oh, hi, Jeff.
Phone number I didn't take this. Hey.
Did I recognize your cell phone number?
Thank you.
So Jeff's part of the team that's been working on the regulations. He's been providing a lot of the technical support and kind of developers viewpoint since he does a lot of kind of development projects at Beals and Thomas, and also has a previous career on the development side. So that's been really helpful. He's been able to point out a few things that MK and I were proposing where he's like, yeah, but if you do that, then this is going to happen. So it's been good. All right, with that, I will open it up for any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. We're a small enough group, or raise your hand or put it in the chat, whatever you prefer. And just while we're waiting to get folks' brains primed for the questions they might have, as MK noted, so this will be kind of everything that we've gone over on the public meetings and talked about with the town throughout the process, and with Hillary, the MVP program, will be summarized in the report along with the draft regulations. And the regulations will stay in draft format until the town, ultimately finalizes them and decides whether to put them forth for public comment. So there certainly will be a public comment period before anything is implemented. Maybe no questions. Oh, go ahead, Beth.
All right, so I will ask the question.
Yeah.
Just around, so first of all, I think this is amazing, and I like that it's going to be bringing us closer to some of the sustainability goals that we're working toward as a town. And we heard loud and clear through the strategic planning process that climate action is something that people are very much interested in. But I know that we're also are working on our first climate action plan. And I'm wondering how the results of this study will tie in and kind of be captured in the climate action plan. So maybe you can just talk to that for just a minute or two. That'd be great. Thank you.
That's a great question that I will bump to Chris, Luis, or Hillary.
Yep, thank you. So, yeah, we are kind of doing the traditional planning department where a number of projects will dovetail together. We're involved in both of those projects, and to the extent possible, we'll try to incorporate the findings of each into each other. This one, kind of wrapping up the draft in June is certainly probably going to be the first through the hoops. The climate action plan, I think, still has some wrap up to complete. But although they're both their own standalone process, obviously, from a staff level, we'll try to kind of marry up the findings of those together. But thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Please raise your hand or just unmute and jump in. Oh, Julie Ross.
Hello, thank you. My question is, how are you planning on doing the public outreach to folks? Yeah, your plan for reaching people.
Right. So I will let the town comment on how they would do that as part of the regulatory adoption process. But I think as far as the outreach that we're doing, we had the two in-person public outreach meetings back in April. We're having this virtual meeting. Chris and Louise, do you want to jump in about how the regs will be distributed?
Yeah, so typically we'll once this wraps up, we'll host it on our website. And we have our normal modes of communication on the website and our social, the town's social media that we'll push out to try and drive some visibility. In addition, in terms of adopting the regulations, what I kind of foresee is some additional review with staff in the community. And that would be in addition to what's the mandatory regulatory of having a planning board hearing on any zoning adoption. But for this, I think, we'll have the time between now and the next annual town meeting to have some additional outreach, and that fits in with some of the department goals that the planning department has to provide additional outreach and engagement with the community beyond what's the regulatory requirements.
So if I were to look for that on the town website, how would I search for that? And I'm assuming it would be under planning and economic development.
Yeah, so we'll likely host it in the planning and economic development page. We have a couple sub pages, like I think there's the resources and reports is likely where we would place this. But again, we'll try to push it out on social media and make the link widely available. And if June 30th rolls around and you're not seeing it, or early July, feel free to email the planning department, planning@shrewsburyma.gov, and we'll be happy to provide that material to you as well.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Beth, you raised your hand again?
Yeah, so Chris, I was also wondering if we could just think through maybe other places where we can have information available, whether it's the senior newsletter, so that might reach a different set of people. Because just thinking through people who maybe aren't going to be visiting our website and providing access, whether it's something as simple as a flyer in the library or on the tables at town hall, just so that there's some paper versions too for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Julie. I don't know if you had raised your hand again. I think if you did, you'll need to unmute.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry.
You're good now. We hear you.
Yeah, I retired. I'm not necessarily as quick on these things as I used to be. Farmers market, I would suggest that. Last summer, that was a wonderful resource. That's a great way to reach out. Just an idea. That's all.
That's a great idea.
And Beth, did you have another question, or was that from the last question?
I'm good. I just need to put my hand down.
Okay,
Sorry.
Thank you.
No worries.
Yeah, I second what Hillary says. Thank you for the outreach opportunity suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts or questions or anything that folks would like to talk through? I have to say it's been great, obviously working with the town and the MVP program on the regulations, but the outreach meetings have been really great as well. We've had a lot of very engaged attendees providing a lot of really good input. So we definitely appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy evenings.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a few familiar names and faces from the original set of outreach meetings. So I'm glad to see the sustained engagement.
Yeah. I'm not seeing anything else in the chat or any raised hands. Just double checking. Thoughts, Chris? Should we call it? And certainly everyone, our contact information, MK brought up that slide, and these
Yes.
slides will be posted. So feel free to reach out to, the town contacts or MK or myself if you have any.
Yes, absolutely. This is not the last opportunity to provide public comment, as I hope we made clear. So please do feel free to reach out.
Right. There's 23 more days until we have to finish everything.
Yeah, and I'll just again say thank you to everyone who put time into working on this and time tonight to come and give some input on the process. Definitely those outreach opportunities. We'll use that. We're always looking for new and innovative ways to reach the public. But again, we're always available as well. During office hours and email, phone. We're always happy to engage with the public. So feel free, whatever way works best for you. We're happy to talk. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. All right.
Great. It's just us now.
Stop the recording.